Nuestro primer orador es el profesor David Gantz, quien tiene la cátedra Samuel N. Factory de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Arizona y es director del programa de Derecho Comercial Internacional. Estudió Derecho en la Universidad de Stanford y en Harvard realizó una especialización en asuntos gubernamentales. Además de la Universidad de Arizona, ha enseñado también en la American University, en Georgetown y en George Washington University, todas en Washington, D.C., además de ser profesor visitante en otras universidades alrededor del mundo. Al inicio de su carrera trabajó para el juez de la Corte de Apelaciones del Noveno Circuito Federal de Estados Unidos, Charles Merrill, entre los años 1969 y 1970. Fue abogado del Departamento de Estado de los Estados Unidos entre los años 1970 y 1977 y socio de la firma Varios en Washington, D.C. hasta el año 93. Profesor Gantz, muy bienvenido, lo escuchamos.
Rodrigo, is this working? Can you hear me? Yes. Rodrigo, thank you for the very nice introduction. I'm very grateful to the Facultad de Derecho of Universidad Mayor, to the National Law Center of Inter-American Free Trade, and also to the Fulbright Commission for the opportunity to be here to speak with you today. In some respects, it's a very nice to be able to stand up here and to tell you, those of you who have not seen it before, that the federal government of the United States is back in operation as of this morning, and that we did not default on our debt last night. So that is, I think, a cause for celebration. The extension is a short one. We may be going through this again in 3 or 4 months, but I'm somewhat optimistic that the way in which this one was done will not be repeated for political reasons. So we can talk about, I think, without quite so much concern as I had up to yesterday, about some of the initiatives that are the subject of my discussion. Now, in fairness, I know almost nothing about commercial law. I do the public side of international trade, and you will be spending the next couple of days on what I would call the private side, but the two, particularly now, I think are intimately related. So what I want to do today is to first talk about some of the alternatives to the Doha development round. To the Doha development round, which I think are possible on the government-to-government public side, and then just briefly mention what are probably equally important, and that is the kinds of things you're talking about here in this conference this week. First of all, I should probably say I think everybody in this room has a general idea of what we're talking about. When we talk about the Doha development round, we're talking about a series of WTO negotiations, mostly in Geneva. You may say, well, why is it called the Doha round? And it's very simple. The meeting to kick it off took place in Doha, Qatar, in November 2001. We called the last round of negotiations the Uruguay round. Why? Because in 1986, the meeting of ministers that resulted in that 8-year discussion took place in Punta del Este. The ministers never returned to Punta del Este. They held all their negotiations in Geneva, with the exception of one meeting, which for reasons I never have understood was held in Montreal, Quebec in February. Nice time to be in Montreal if you ski, but not in a meeting. So in any event, the Doha round has been going on in theory for 12 years. Actually, nothing's happened much beyond 2008, but it's been pretty clear that at least now, and perhaps for the foreseeable future, it's going to be very hard to get much useful done in terms of liberalizing trade in a group of 159 countries where you have to have a consensus to do anything. You can't probably today get a consensus that it is Thursday, so it's very difficult. Some would argue that because of the major changes that came about
with the Uruguay round, it was too soon to ask developing countries in particular to make all of these changes in intellectual property and services and transparency and customs and all those things so soon. Secondly, you have a great increase in middle-income country economic power. Some of them, like the members of the Pacific Alliance, are very much in favor of liberalization. Others, like the BRICS, at least 3 of the BRICS, I wouldn't really put China in that category, but certainly Brazil, India, and Russia are not very much in favor of liberalization, and they've been, they and the US and the EU have been at loggerheads for most of the last 10 years. Even within the developing world, you know, sometimes we are all prone to making generalizations. You know, lots of Americans think Latin America is a single group, where actually, of course, the diversity is enormous, particularly in the area of international trade, where you have the 4 Pacific Alliance countries going one way, and countries like Brazil and Venezuela and Argentina and Ecuador going in opposite directions. And they're all members of the WTO. To be perfectly honest, some of this resistance is just fear of the country that is going to be the world's largest economic power fairly soon, and how to deal with the relations with China. China has been very, I think, very proactive in this area, gone out and concluded dozens of free trade agreements, dozens of bilateral investment treaties to try to deal with some of these concerns, and I think it's had some considerable success in that area. You have the problem in the US and all other countries. Liberalizing trade hurts some people as well as it helps others in the general population, and sometimes the people that don't like it have very powerful connections to the political system, and that's true whether it's a so-called democracy or a so-called one-party system. You have interest groups in all of those countries that resist liberalization. In the US in particular, the business community has never been terribly supportive of the Doha round. The biggest interest in the business community at the end of the last century was getting China into the WTO, which happened, fortunately, for all of us. They never had that much interest in what was going on in Doha. You have, in many countries, to some extent, including the United States, an expansion in industrial policies, picking certain industries. In the US, we subsidize all sorts of alternative energy, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. There's a lot more use of non-tariff barriers, particularly in such countries as Brazil and Argentina, which sort of is a step backward. And again, as I mentioned before, if you're going to essentially get 159 countries to agree on anything, including the day of the week, it's going to be a difficult negotiation. Okay, so that's why nothing is happening in Doha, in Geneva, and probably won't for some time. So what do you do instead? And this is what we're going to talk about in the next 10 minutes. You have some limited multilateral agreements, trade facilitation, food security, maybe even green technology. There was supposed to be agreement on this in December in a Bali meeting this year. At the moment, there's no agreement on anything. It's hard to know whether anything will happen 2 months from now. You have the so-called plurilateral agreements among willing WTO members, including most of the countries who have sent academics to this conference. The government procurement agreement, I don't think China has joined it yet, but it will soon. The information technology agreement, which China and I think everybody else here are members. That's not true. Mexico is not. The international agreement, a new agreement that is being negotiated, International Trade and Services Agreement, which is probably going to be done in a restrictive manner as essentially a free trade agreement under services, so that those who do not participate will not be able to enjoy the benefits. There are some efforts to revise existing trade agreements, the NAFTA, even within the European Union, Mercosur, not really that much, Asian FTA, mostly in the context of other negotiations, but there will be changes, and part of that is because nothing's happening in Geneva. And then, of course, we get to the really fun stuff. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that's between the US and the EU, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, ASEAN plus 6 other countries, including China, and the Pacific Alliance, which is going to be discussed in a couple of minutes. And then the kinds of things we're doing here, or are related at least, the unilateral initiatives. Chile is one of the leaders in that area, and the model laws or coordinated areas, not only secure transactions and simplified incorporation, but bankruptcy in a number of other areas. This is just a list. We've already mentioned those. Most of you know who the TPP partners are. I think of the many agreements that are being discussed, and as most of you know, there are more than 400 regional trade agreements now in existence. These are probably among the very most important just because of the nature of the groupings. This, of course, is the one that has received the most attention. Came out of a P4 agreement among a bunch of much smaller countries, Brunei, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore. The U.S. saw it, I think, as a relatively safe thing to do, even though the Obama administration, particularly in its first term, didn't think much of trade agreements at all. It did think a great deal about becoming more active economically, as well as showing the flag politically in the Far East, in Asia. And so we have this so-called pivot toward Asia. And this is a significant part of it. For a long time, most people in the U.S. weren't paying much attention to the TPP because without Japan and then Canada and Mexico, economically it had very little significance for the U.S., although it did obviously from a political point of view. But once Japan joined, everything changed. I was in Washington at that time, and all of a sudden the Chamber of Commerce and all the other business groups who had pretty much ignored the TPP after then were very, very enthusiastic about having better access to the Japanese market. So that really changed the politics rather substantially. Obviously, it makes it more complicated. All of these 3 additional countries are major economies, and they all have their own issues. One of the attractions for people like me who have been playing around with NAFTA for more than 20 years is this might be a way of improving NAFTA without having to do it directly, which is politically impossible. But it's a very difficult process. There's a reason why this negotiation has been going on for 3 years, and why, despite what some governments are saying, it's not going to be completed in 2013, and I think that was true even before Mr. Obama had to cancel his trip last week to the area. The issues are pretty obvious, I think, for most of us: the agriculture, investment, and banking questions in Japan. In the U.S., the fact that we do not have legal authority from the Congress yet to conclude this agreement, and all sorts of issues involving the auto industry. Canada's in there mostly because they want access to Japan, but they're worried about dairy products and agricultural products as well. The Vietnamese, and to some extent the Singaporeans, are very concerned about regulation of state-owned enterprises. For Vietnam, agriculture, textile market access is probably the most significant issue, and there are IP questions as well. But it's a very broad agreement, probably much broader than most of the Asian free trade agreements among various parties. Trade in goods, services, agricultural trade, maybe. The SOEs, something called regulatory coherence, which mostly means consistency of regulatory practices. Certain changes in the investment provisions. Expansion, maybe, of the IP protections, given the power of the pharmaceutical and agricultural chemical industries in the U.S., and probably expanded government procurement. These are the issues. There are going to be a lot of compromises if an agreement is actually going to be reached, but these are certainly among the most complicated problems that we face, at least in the U.S. and many of the other parties as well. There probably will be some immigration provisions for business visitors, some sort of anti-competition rules, probably what's in the Singapore-U.S. free trade agreement, and then these issues which are really on the forefront of this global business economy: business facilitation, including some provisions for smaller businesses, labor and environment, who knows how far that will go, e-commerce, pretty obvious, maybe less restricted trade in green energy goods and services, although much of the work there is being done at APEC, some sort of safeguards, some sort of dispute settlement. And once again, it's going to be a broad package. Everything's got to be agreed, or many parties won't go along with it, so that raises questions as well. I'm just guessing on Chile's objectives. Professor Hassan can fill us in, but obviously market access in the raw materials, certainly in some agriculture and fisheries. I assume it's important to have newer markets and better markets for exports of wine. We can learn more about this on the trip Saturday. And I think if you want to study wine, the best way to do it is at a winery where you can taste it. Professional services certainly will be of interest to those of us who are lawyers. And I think for Chile in particular, given the diversity and beauty of this country, there must be huge opportunities to improve tourism and tourist services. Okay, for lawyers, I think there's some very interesting challenges. You've got an agreement that is among countries that among themselves already have more than 40 free trade agreements. The potential for legal work here, I think, is enormous. There will undoubtedly be some, maybe even in this group, who can send their children to college based on the last few months. I like the idea of improving NAFTA rules of origin, updated investment provisions. As some of you know, Chile was supposed to be the 4th member of NAFTA in around 1994-95. For a variety of internal political reasons in the United States, it never happened. The result was that Mexico and Canada each concluded bilateral agreements in 1995 and 1996, and the U.S. finally figured out how to do it in 2002. What does that mean? It means that you have very interesting conflicts and annoying conflicts in rules of origin. A product which is considered an originating good made in Mexico with parts that come from any of the 3 countries can be traded in North America, but it doesn't necessarily mean it can be traded duty-free with Chile. This is, to put it mildly, a ridiculous situation. There's been some discussions about trying to harmonize this. They haven't worked. So one possible benefit for NAFTA and for Chile coming out of this agreement is we have more uniform rules of origin, so manufacturers in Mexico, for example, don't have to go through hoops to use different parts and components in order to ship goods, the same goods, to Chile that they're already shipping to the United States and Canada. There's some other areas. E-commerce wasn't very important in 1992. It is now. Maybe different IP provisions, certainly improved provisions for technical barriers to trade and phytosanitary provisions involving food safeties. Again, the same question that is the one in Doha. Do TPP negotiators have the political courage to do this? And is it going to be easier, much easier, to do an agreement among 12 very diverse economies than it is among 159 diverse economies? I think it is, but it's not clear that we can succeed. So what does that mean? It means that the kind of work that is being done here by this center, by the National Law Center, by a lot of you in your individual group capacity, do not come from trade agreements at all, the WTO, the GATT, or anything. They come because governments decided it was a good idea to liberalize. Sometimes, if you can't do it as a matter of in international agreement, you just decide, and the government decides that it's going to do it, and it has the political power and the backing to actually make unilateral changes, whether it's national legislation or whether it's based on uniform laws, model laws from the OAS or UNCITRAL. And we lots of talk in the trade community about the 4 tigers in Asia, right? Hong Kong, Singapore, to a lesser extent, I think Taiwan and South Korea. I like to talk about the 4 jaguars in Latin America, which happen to be, of course, Chile, Mexico, Colombia, and Peru, the Pacific Alliance countries, who are doing the same kinds of things, and in some cases more effectively than the Asian countries did, particularly South Korea and Taiwan. If you look at the tariff reduction and the non-tariff reduction that have taken place in Chile over the last 20 years or so, and in the other 3 over the last 10 years, you discover, for example, that the average applied tariff rates in these 4 South American countries are lower than those in Korea or Taiwan. They've gone further. They've superseded. Nobody's going to supersede Singapore and Hong Kong. They're wide open economies. But in terms of the rest, opposite direction from what Brazil and some of the others are doing. So anyway, Chile's a pioneer of these groups. But I think there has been, and I think with Chile, there has been a very important demonstration effect for the other countries in this grouping. And these are the obvious things: transparency, sound financial institutions, the Washington consensus, which is both positive and negative, lots of privatization, a lot of deregulation, probably much too much, certainly in the United States, but in general, a more liberal process, political stability, a lot of bilateral investment treaties, improved economic relations with not only with the US, but with the EU, and a lot of support from the private sector. So again, your areas of discussion, I won't go over them again, but you know what they are. And the beauty of it is that this can be done if you can convince your national legislatures to do it. It's much more focused than a major trade treaty, which means it probably has less opposition. So I think there's enormous potential there. I worried more last week than I do this week, that the US won't be able to do what the kind of things it's been doing in terms of economic leadership in this area for the last 60 years. It was very upsetting to some of us that these trips had to be canceled at a critical time in the TPP negotiations in particularly. I think the president strongly wants to pursue this pivot to the Pacific and these major negotiations, but we've got to do it in a reliable, independent, and consistent manner, or I think our allies and friends will wonder whether we can follow through. I think we'll have a very good indication of how well this is going to happen if the president decides to reschedule his Asian trip soon, like in the next few months. I hope that will happen. But again, if you've got these questions, and let's face it, the US is not the only government that has troubles doing what ought to be done. There's an awful lot that academics and the private sector, with some cooperation from the national legislatures, can do to move this process of trade liberalization forward at a time when not much is happening in Geneva, and some of these regional trade agreements may go forward and some may not. So that's my contribution. Thank you.